So guys, today we are going to continue our discussion related to minimal API. So some of the advanced feature which is mandatory if you are going to develop minimal API. So those features we are going to discuss in today's session. So mostly what we are going to discuss, we are going to discuss the filters concept, that is the endpoint filter, and we are also going to discuss how to implement authentication and authorization with the endpoint filter. So authentication and authorization in minimal API. So what are endpoint filters? Why we need endpoint filters? What are the things they are going to do? Let us try to understand. So forget about endpoint filter. Now I'm just going to ask you, right? So if you are developing some APIs using the controller based approach, means you are creating some controller within the controller you are applying, right? You are creating some action methods, and now I'm giving you some task that can you please implement some kind of a pre-processing logic, post-processing logic at the different stages of the request processing pipeline. Then what are the different kind of filters you need to use? Guys, answer me. If you are going to implement some kind of a pre and post processing logic as a different levels of the request processing cycle, then what are the different filters you generally use in ASP.NET Core Web API?
Authorization,
Authentication,
Okay. So
exception
basically,
handling,
you are going to use authorization filter, which is coming into the picture first.
authentication.
Then there is no such authentication filter available. Did you discuss anything called authentication filter?
Authorization is for authentication and
Authorization filter. So
authorization.
authorization filter, what we are using, that is internally going to do both the task, authentication as well as authorization. So there is no specific authentication filter available. So one is authorization filter. Then we are going to make use of a resource filter, right? So after resource filter, we are making use of a action filter. Then we are going to make use of a result filter. Then we are also going to make use of a exception filter. So these filters are basically going to provide some kind of a right cross-cutting concerns, right? So basically, if you want to implement logging, if you want to implement caching, if you want to modify the response, if you want to short-circuit the request, if you want to validate the user, right? Then for this kind of things, you need to use filter. Similarly, when you work with the ASP.NET Core minimal API, these filters are not available. Why not available? Because this filter, what we discussed, authorize, result, exception, that response filter, resource filter, right? So these are not available with minimal API. Why? Now, because these filters are specifically designed to build on action methods or controllers. So at the controller level or at the action method level, you can apply this filter. Filter, see, if you remember when we discussed the concept of filter and versus middleware component, at that time, what we discussed? We discussed middleware is going to be applicable at the right global in the sense once you create and apply middleware, that will be applicable to all the controllers and all the action methods. Whereas whereas filters are specifically designed for actions, not for the global level where it will be applicable to all the action method. If that is what your requirement, then best approach and the suggestion is to go with middleware component. Middleware means global. Filter means specific to action method. So now when we come to ASP.NET Core Web API, then these filters are available and we can happily use them. But now coming to minimal API, so definitely minimal API, right? Whether you are developing RESTful services or whether you are developing minimal API, what is our main objective? Main objective to develop RESTful services which is going to be consumed by the client or a different kind of consumers. Now, so doesn't matter whether you are developing the RESTful APIs using the controller-based approach or using the minimal API. Yes, The implementation is going to be different completely, but functional wise, from the end, from the client's point of view, this is not going to make any kind of a differences. So now, what is my requirement? My requirement is in my ASP.NET Core minimal API. I also want to apply such kind of a filters. I want to validate the request. I want to authenticate the user. I want to log the request and the response time to measure how much time that endpoint filter took to complete the execution. I want to short circuit the request if the response is already available in the caching. So if you want to apply this kind of functionality to your minimal API, then you have only one option, that is endpoint filter. This endpoint filter is completely different than the filter what we discussed with minimal with ASP.NET Core Web API. In ASP.NET Core Web API, those filters are different, and this minimal right, for this minimal API, this endpoint filter is specifically designed, and this endpoint filters allows us to add customer pre and post processing logic, customer pre and post processing logic that is going to be execute before executing the endpoint handler, after executing the endpoint handler, or instead of executing the endpoint handler, this customer logic is going to be executed. So basically you can consider this endpoint filters are similar to your middleware component, right? This endpoint sim filters are similar to your middleware components. Only difference is that middleware components are going to be applicable to all the endpoint, right, which we defined in our application. Whereas this endpoint filter can apply to specific handler. Wherever you want that kind of logic, there only you need to apply. Clear?
Yep.
Yes.
Right, so what are the different kind of things you can do? You can validate the incoming request. If the request is invalid, you can return some 400 request. You can do authentication and authorization using this endpoint filter. You can create a custom logging. You can create a custom exception handling. You can measure the performance by checking how much time each action method took to complete the execution. So these are some of the real-time scenarios that what you need to understand. Right now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to discuss how you can implement this request validation, how you can implement this performance measuring, right? So some of the caching, also caching is not available here. That caching is also available, so authorization is also available. Let us try to proceed and implement all these real-time scenarios in our application. So first of all, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create one validation filter. So currently, if you look at currently, if you look at our application code, so in the case of a post request, in the case of a post request, I'm writing this code logic. And in the put request, I'm also writing the same logic or not. Yes or no? Logic,
Yes.
see, in this case, I'm passing this new employee, and in this case, I'm passing this update employee. But if you look at the logic, that right, the statement, all these statements are going to be same. That means we are repeating the same code or not.
Yes.
Second thing, do you think that right this validation logic should part of our right handler, or it should be in a separate class? It should be in a
Separate.
separate class, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a endpoint filter, right? I'm going to create a endpoint filter. That endpoint filter going to have a generic class, sorry, generic method. That filter is going to have a generic method. That generic method will take one class type parameter like employee, product, whatever you want, you can use, you can pass. And by once it take that right class type parameter, then it is going to inspect whatever all the metadata available within that type, like whatever all data annotation attributes are applied, and then it is going to validate whether all the data annotation, whatever value you provided, whether these values are satisfied with the data annotation applied to individual properties. If satisfied, then that's fine. If not satisfied, then that filter, endpoint filter itself, going to return 400 bad request error to the client. This logic, whatever we have written here, we should not write here. Rather than this logic needs to be shipped to the corresponding endpoint filter. Similarly, the similar kind of validation. Similar means wherever you need the entity validation or the model validation, there only we need to apply the filter. So let us try to first create, right? Let us first try to understand how to create endpoint filter. Then I will show you how to apply the endpoint filter to our endpoint handler, or you can say to these endpoints, and then I will show you what is the execution order of an endpoint filter. So three things we need to understand. First, we will create a endpoint filter. Then we will apply the endpoint filter. Then we will understand the execution order of an endpoint filter. So multiple endpoint. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create multiple scenarios, right? Multiple scenarios in the sense two, three different kind of real-time examples I'm going to take to make you understand this endpoint filter, and definitely you will right enjoy how this is going to right reduce our lots of repetitive code and how it can help us to make our handler code clean so that we can easily understand now. So now, if you look at the employee model, if you look at the employee model, now currently this name, position, and salary is decorated with some kind of a data annotation attribute. Now, the validation part, right, validating the salary is right, satisfying this data annotation attribute, position satisfying this data annotation, name satisfying this data annotation attributes or not. What we are going to do, we are going to create a endpoint filter. So let us proceed and create an endpoint filter, validation endpoint filter. So let me go ahead within the models folder. I'm going to create a class file named validation endpoint filter. So any name you can give, but as this is going to be endpoint filter, I'm ending this class name with an endpoint filter. So any other naming convention, if you want to follow, you can also follow. So let me go ahead. So this is my class file. So here you can see as this is going to work with a generic type. Means what? Now this generic class and generic method what we are creating, it is not specific to a in the single model. It is not specific to a single model. Any type of model within your application you want to validate, and if that model is decorated with some kind of a data annotation attribute, then this generic class and the generic method will validate that model. So why we are creating this generic? Why not creating directly employee? Because if I'm going with this right non-generic approach, means if I'm creating one validate employee endpoint filter, validate product endpoint filter, validate right different kind of endpoint filter, doesn't make any sense. So basically, what we need to do, we need to create the class and method generic so that the same pricing method can be applicable to all the different types of a model which we want to validate. Clear? Clear or not? Why we are making this class as a generic class and this method as a generic?
Yep.
Right? Because we want this model, I mean this endpoint filter, validate different kind of a model, employee, product, order, category, right? Whatever. All. So if you want to create a right, what I can say, endpoint filter, it must be it must be implement this I endpoint filter interface. So this is your class name. This class is inherited from this endpoint filter interface, and this endpoint filter interface provide one method that is invoke async, and this is the method which is going to be automatically invoked when we applied this filter to some endpoint in our minimal API. How that is going to be happening, we will see later. For time being, for now to understand how to create an endpoint filter, so we need to create a custom class. That custom class needs to inherit from the I endpoint filter interface. That I endpoint filter interface provide one asynchronous method called invoke async, and that method we need to provide implementations. And what is this ORT model is a class? Can anybody tell me? So this is nothing but a constraint. Constraint, you can say constraint, you can say some kind of a rules. So what type of a constraint or rules is this? Now the rule is that the T model, whatever the type you are going to specify, that must be a class type. So instead of a class, you can specify interface, you can specify some built-in data type integer, any type you can specify. But here we are 100% sure this definitely going to be a class type. If it is not a class, then we should not proceed and do the validation. Clear?
Yes.
Yep.
Right. So now if you look at this method, right, it is going to right that this method is taking two parameters. What are the parameters? It is taking the context object and it is taking the next delegate. So next delegate, you already know. What is the meaning of this next delegate? Now, whatever the middleware component registered to this middleware, or you can say this validation endpoint filter, that component is going to be executed. That next middleware component is going to execute after executing this logic. So what is this context object? So the context object provide access to the HTTP context object. Means what? Now what is the request information? What are the request query string parameter? What is the request route data? What is the request method? What is the request path? Right? All these informations you can access using this context. Even right. For example, you are passing some argument. Argument in the sense your method is taking some kind of a parameter. So employee type, product type. So those parameter also you are going to validate whether that parameter is of a specific type or not. So in this case, that parameter definitely going to be of type T model. So first, let us try to understand what we are doing. So this is going to give you the information about the HTTP request. This next means the next middleware component which is registered to be invoked after this middleware component. So first of all, what we need to do, we need to extract the model. So we need to extract the model means what? Now currently, this context.argument. Context.argument means what? Now this context is going to give you information about what? About the completely HTTP request. So this HTTP request involves right all the informations like the parameter, like the arguments, like the method name, like the context path, right? Every query string around it, every information. Now, from this information, what we need to do, we need to understand: is there any parameter or argument available which is of type T model? For example, if you are invoking this, right, if you are registering this validate endpoint filter specifying employee, I will show you how to register this endpoint filter and how to specify the employee object. Then what we need to do here, T model is employee. So we need to investigate, we need to verify the arguments and we need to check, is there any argument of type T model is available? If available, please return the first one. So this model is nothing but it can be the instance, it can be the instance of employee, it can be the instance of a product, it can be the instance of anything. For example, suppose while registering this validate endpoint filter, you specify the T model as employee. Then this statement is going to check, right, within the argument list of arguments, is there any type available of a model, right, employee type? If available, then that instance please store here. If the instance is null, means there is no data. For example, your endpoint filter having one employee object, right, as a parameter, but you are not passing that employee object in the request body. Then in that case, that employee parameter, whatever you define, for example, in this case, right, where is our program class? So in this case, so this is going to my new employee, I employee repository, I logger, right? So these are different kind of a parameter. So now, whenever someone passing some argument, see, whenever you are defining, this is parameter. Whenever you are passing the data to the method, right? That is going to be argument, right? So if someone not passing any argument of an employee object, then what value it is going to hold, right? You guys know what is the difference between
Yes,
argument and parameter?
yes, yes, sir.
So whenever you are defining the method, right, at the time of a method signature, whatever right variable you declare, like this employee integer, whatever. So this is nothing but your parameter. And whenever you are calling that method, whatever the value you are passing, that value is going to be your argument, right? For example, you defined one employee object, employee parameter here. And if you are not passing one employee argument, then what value it is going to hold?
It will be null.
No. Right? The same thing we are doing here. So we are checking any argument, any value is passed by the user of employee type. If yes, then that object is going to be hold here. If object is equals to null, means what? Now means the user doesn't specify any value. For example, if you are not passing any employee object, then in that case that employee parameter going to hold null value. So in case of null, what error message we need to return, guys? Any right as per your requirement, any right error message JSON like this string, anything you can return. Now now as right, we have already discussed this validation helper method. So right, like this one validation result, so here we are checking this one. And then right, we are creating a variable to hold all the validation error. We are creating one object to hold, right, right, store the metadata about the object. And then we are calling this try object method. The same thing I'm doing here. So I'm creating a validation context object based on this model. So this validation context is going to contain all the metadata. Metadata means whatever the object, right? Employee. Employee. So in the employee type, whatever all right properties are there, and for each property, whatever all data annotation attributes are there, that all these informations are going to be stored by this variable. Validation result means it is going to hold the list of errors, right? If anything found during the model validation. Then what we need to do, I need to call this try validate object method similar to this one, right? Model, validation context, validation result, and a true. So same thing, model, validation context, validate result, and a true. So if the validation is successful, we are using the NOT operator. So it will move to the next statement, and it will call the next middleware component or the next endpoint filter, whatever registered into the request processing pipeline. If the validation failed, then what we need to do? We need to fetch all the error message from the validation results, and then we need to prepare the BAT request. 400 BAT request. Any custom message you want to provide, you can provide. Clear?
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Right? So this is going to be our first middleware component, which is going to validate the incoming request of all any type of a model you take into consideration. That model is going to be validated by this endpoint filter. So the next what we are going to do, we are going to create another middle, right, another endpoint filter for logging the request with request type. For example, when the request start, when the request end, and how much time it took to complete that request processing. Right. For that purpose, we are going to create one endpoint filter. Right. So this is basically for the performance measurement. So let me go ahead and create another filter called logging endpoint filter. So go to the right models folder. So you can create a separate folder called endpoint filter, and there you can create. Simplicity, I'm creating everything inside a single class. So now this endpoint filter is going to store when the request starts, when the request end, and how much time. Now, do I need to make this endpoint filter generic? No. Why? Because we are not going to take any input parameter. So when we need generic, when we are going to take dynamic parameter. So in this case, we are not going to take any parameter. So you can see, but in this case, we are going to make use of a logging. So we have already registered the logging. So here you can see the log label is default. And in the program class also, you can see we are adding the logger, right? One is the console logger, another one is the debug logger. You can implement Serilog, you can log the data into a text file, you can log the data into a database, and that's what we have already discussed. So, right? So now, Now the logger is there and we are also initializing that logger. The framework will take the responsibility to inject the logger instance now. Now let us try to understand the logic. The same logic, same method, right? Context return type is object. Object means superclass. Superclass means you can return anything. So object is the super type in .NET. If your return type is object means what means you can return any type of data. So here I'm putting this question mark to ensure you can also return null value, right? So here and the same thing also I'm doing here, right? So object nullable type. So now what I'm doing here, I'm going to make use of stopwatch. That is the reason why the system.diagnostics namespace is provided. So I'm starting the stopwatch. So the watch is started. And then I'm putting this statement that request started. You can see using this context, as I have mentioned, you can access every information, right? So here you can see I'm accessing the request method. What is the method name? What is the path? All this information I have logged here. Then I'm calling the next middleware component using this one, this delegate. So whatever the endpoint filter that is going to execute, process the request, handle the request, generate the response, and then right, it will again come to this plus as we are using the await operator. Then it will stop the stopwatch. So before the start and stop time, how much time it take, that what we can access. So here you can say I have written this statement, finished request method path, and how much time it will take, right, in millisecond, that what I am going to log. So basically between the start and stop, our endpoint filter is right, our endpoint is going to execute, and how much time that took, that what we have calculated and printed here. So basically this endpoint filter is going to log the request start, request end, and how much time that right, how much time the API is to complete the request, that what we are printing here. Clear?
Yes.
Right, so this is going to be used for the performance benchmark. So now another important scenario that what we are going to discuss, the caching. So for example, some of the data which is not going to be changed frequently. So when the request comes, you can implement some kind of caching. If the data is available in the cache, then please return the data from the cache. Otherwise, invoke the endpoint. The endpoint is going to deal with the database or whatever, return the data. Before returning the data, cache the data and return to the client. So basically, that filter is going to short circuit the request if the data is already available in the cache. Otherwise, it will allow the endpoint to be executed. Once the endpoint is executed, again, whatever the response is going to be returned. Before returning the response, it is going to store the data in the cache and then return the response. So that when the request comes, right, the same request comes next time, it will get the information from the cache. So the caching functionality also going to be implemented. Let me go ahead and create another endpoint filter for the same caching endpoint filter. As I'm giving you multiple examples so that you will get better clarity of a different kind of a scenario, right? Suppose you are attending the interviewer might be ask you, can you please give me some of the scenario of endpoint filter? So first of all, you need to tell when to use endpoint filter. Endpoint filter is specifically for minimal API. Then you can give different scenario. For this particular scenario, we can create another endpoint filter. For that scenario, we can also create another endpoint filter. See, so again, this is going to be a non-generic, means we are not taking any input parameter or any type. So it is going to simple class. Memory cache to store the data in memory. Instead of a memory cache, you can make use of a distributed caching like Redis cache. We have already discussed how to implement Redis cache. That is your part, how to use. So now this is the duration, how much time the cache data is going to be there. At the duration we are going to store. So here caching endpoint. So first of all, this iMemory cache will be provided by framework. This time span duration we are taking right at the time of registering this endpoint filter. If this time or duration is provided, that is fine. If not provided, then default time is set to 30 seconds, right? So that is what we are doing here. Then what I'm doing here, I'm using this invoke async method. Return type is again object of nullable type. So HTTP context right? So why we are getting this context object? Now, because I want to create a cache key based on the method, based on the path, based on the core string. So whatever the request method, whatever the request path, whatever the core string, by taking this information, I have created one cache key, right? So once the cache key is generated, then I'm checking whether this cache key is available in memory. If it is available, then get the object and return the object. And here we are short circuiting the request. So we are returning the response means it will not execute remaining statement. If this key is not available in the cache, then what we need to do? Then we need to call the next middleware component. That might be the next endpoint handler, or that going to be a next um, filter, right? Whatever is registered, that is going to be invoked. And once you got the result, you need to ensure that result is I result. I result is typically the API response. If you are returning some response from a API, mostly it is going to be I result. And if the result is I result, then store that result in the cache for that specific duration what you set here, and finally return the result. So these are the three endpoint filter in our application. Now, guys, remember, if you look at this one, right, we are having this error middleware component, which is going to handle the exception. Then in my program class, right, if you look at this, do I need to write this try catch statement again and again in each action method? If that is going to be handled by this error handler middleware component, do I need this try catch?
No.
No.
That means it is going to be some kind of a repetitive code. Try, catch, oh, why I'm going to do this thing? Because this error middleware are going to do the same thing, right? So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how to apply this endpoint filters into our application and the execution part. So go to the program class. Let me replace this code now. So first of all, we need to enable the memory cache. So this service is going to be there, add memory cache. And these things we have already discussed, that is clearing the default provider, adding the console and the debug provider. The serialization settings we have already discussed. We want to return the right property name as it is, that is the disabling the camel case. So this is going to be my repository, which we have already created, that what we have registered, that employee repository. And now we have created three endpoint filters. So this three filter we are also registering here as a scope service, right? So now, so scope service, why? Because we want this to be created only once per request. So if you want, you can also make this as a, right, what I can say, add singleton. So that is also fine. See, now, so this is my right configuration. I'm registering my DB context to use SQL Server connect, right, SQL Server database, and the connection string will get from the offsetting status.json file. So then I'm build the application. If the application environment is development, then I'm showing the Swagger UI, and then I'm registering the error handler middleware component. So this middleware component is the first component, and which is going to be execute. And as part of this error handler middleware component within the try block, rest of the request processing pipeline is going to be execute. So this is my employee endpoint. So currently you can see I have removed that try catch block, and here I'm applying two endpoint filter. One is logging endpoint filter, another one is caching endpoint filter. Guys, remember the filters are going to be executed in this way, right? In the same order they are applied to the endpoint. So to apply any endpoint filter, what you need to do, you need to use the add endpoint filter middleware component. So to apply any endpoint filter, you have to use add endpoint filter generic method. So this is a generic method. And to this method, you have to specify what filter is going to be applied first. In this case, logging. What filter going to be applied next? In this case, caching. So now can anybody tell me, right? As I have mentioned, so this is going to execute first, then the second filter is going to execute. So what is the best order? So do I need to apply the logging filter first, or the caching filter first? Which one is going to be the appropriate way? So this is going to be your right a technical skill or right, thinking about the problem. So which one is the appropriate approach? What should be the first filter? Should the logging or should the caching, and why? Can anybody tell me?
Logging
Right?
first we can apply, then we can apply caching because logging for the first time it ensure that uh,
Yes.
the
So
log
logging
is
will ensure
executed.
that request is received, request is processed by the system, and how much time it took. That what it is going to ensure. If we apply caching first, then if that caching is going to short circuit the request by returning the response, then this logging will not come into the picture. Then how? Then how we can ensure whether the request is received by the framework by our API or not? So that what we need to ensure. So definitely logging first and then the caching. Then how the execution is going to be happening. See, first of all, whatever the filters you are registered in the same order they are going to be executed. That means when first this filter is going to execute, second this filter is going to be execute, then only the middleware component, sorry, then only the endpoint is going to execute. So first logging endpoint filter, right, whatever the logic you have written, this is going to execute. After then the caching filter, right? This logic is going to be execute, and then only that endpoint what you right provided here, that endpoint handler, that is going to be execute. Once the endpoint handler is completed, then again the filter are going to be executed in the reverse order. Means then the caching filter, then the logging filter. Clear?
Yeah.
Anyone having any question? And guys, remember one more thing. Unlike the filters, right, which we apply to the action method, right? Like you can apply multiple action filters, right? Authorization filter, custom right action filter, result filter, exception filter, resource filter. But these filters are having some specific, what I can say, order. But in this case, there is no specific order. Here, the filter means the way you apply it, they are going to be execute in the same order. Once they execute, then the handler is going to execute. Once the handler is executed, then the filter are going to be executed in the reverse order. Clear or no? How to apply the filter and what is the execution order of the filter? Is that clear?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Similarly, this is my employee by ID method. I have removed that unnecessary try catch block because we are using this error middleware. And here also I'm applying the logging and caching. So now this is my employee. So it is a post request. So here the employee object. Do I need to validate this employee? Currently you can see that validation, that custom validation logic we have removed. That validation helper is no longer used, right? Then can anybody tell me what will be the appropriate way to apply the filter in this case? What are the different kind of filters we need to apply?
First we use logging, then validation endpoint filter, then we use caching endpoint filter.
So you just tell me why you should use caching here. Means you are having a caching filter means I can apply that caching everywhere.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is there any need
But
for
it's
the caching
post.
filter?
No, because post.
The
There's no need
caching
of
filter can only be used whenever you are performing the important
get.
step method operation, get request, not for the post patch delete. So this is not a get request. This is a post request. So post request means you should not have the caching filter. So first logging filter, then only you have to apply the validation filter. And here you can see whenever I'm applying the validation filter, that type I need to specify. Why? Because this is a generic filter. Clear? This type, for example, here it is employee object. I'm passing employee. Some other places that might be a order object, might be a payment object, might be a right something different. So whatever the type of object you want to validate by the filter, that type you need to pass here. Clear?
Yes.
Yep.
right? So then again, this is going to be my put method. Again, I'm applying that logging filter and validation filter. And this is my delete method. And here I'm only applying the logging filter. No right validation filter, no caching filter. Why? Because we are not storing any data in or retrieving from the cache, and we are not taking any request body, which is model, which is decorating with some data annotation attribute. So no validation filter. Clear?
Yes.
Yep.
So how to register the filter, how to create the filter, how to apply the filter to independent or individual right endpoint. Is that clear, or anyone having any question? Clear or not?
Yes, clear.
Okay. So now, so with these changes, now you can test the functionality and it should work as expected. To get the employees, so first request you should see taking more time. So how much time it took? So this is the select statement executed. Yes, we are using engine framework code. And this is the time it took to execute, right? How much time it took? Firstly, so minimal API. So starting request, see, this is my starting request, right? Logging filter. You can say this is the logging filter log, and this is also the logging filter log. So it is store this starting the request get employee, finished request get employee. So if you look at this, so logging filter we are using this one. So method means it is a get method or post method, and what is the path? Path means what is the endpoint. So that what we are logging. So slash employee, and how much time it took? 1989. And within this, we are executing some repository pattern. So if you look at this employee repository, so fetching all employees asynchronously. So that log statement is also written here. And this is the SQL statement which is executed on the database. Now, if I invoke the request again, right, then you will see this logic is not going to be executed. That logging logic you will see, and that caching is also going to be executed, right? So let me run this one more time and show you. See, so that right, you can see it is executing one more time. Okay, so within 30 seconds, if you invoke, it will execute. Right, after 30 seconds, it will again go to the database. So now you can say employee. So you can say 24 second, 2 millisecond, 1 millisecond, 2 millisecond. And if you invoke after 30 seconds, again it will get the data from the database. Why? Because we have set the duration as 30 seconds. Caching duration as 30 seconds. Clear? Yes
Yes.
or no? Right? So this is how it is going to be work now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new object. So now, so this is going to be, I just remove this two parameter, name and a position. So I just remove this two parameter, name and a position. If you look at the right employee class, so this name and position are a required parameter or not? Yes, required parameter. So if we are not passing the value for those parameter, definitely it will return me bad request and error you can see. Validation failed, name is required, position is required. Clear? So
Yes.
the logging filter is working, validation filter is working, caching filter is working. Yes or no?
Yes.
So this is how you need to work with the endpoint filter if you are right working with a minimal API. Okay. So now what I'm going to discuss is I'm going to discuss the last piece of information, that is how to apply security to JWT authentication. So JWT authentication, see guys, remember, whenever the term security comes into the picture, the first point is JWT authentication. So nowadays it is very popular to use JWT authentication whenever developing RESTful services. So let us proceed and see how we can implement JWT authentication in our application. So JWT means, we have already discussed, JSON Web Token. It is an open standard for securely transforming information between two parties. One is the client, another one is the server. So this provides a mechanism to authenticate the user, whether the client or the consumer is a valid user or not, whether the client or consumer has valid right permission to access the resource or not. So this is not only going to provide the authentication, but also going to give you the authorization logic, right? It means what? So it is not only going to verify who the user is, but also going to check whether the user has permissions to access the resource or not. So how it is going to work? Now, first of all, we need to generate one token. That signed token is going to be generated by the server or system, and that token needs to be sent in each and every request by the client to the server for accessing the resources for which authentication and authorization is required. Some of the endpoint you need authentication authorization, some of the endpoint might be public, anybody can access. So those endpoint for which authentication and authorization is required, for that purpose, what we are going to do, we are going to create a authorization and filter. And for those which don't record, we don't need to apply. For example, in this case, you can see, right? If I'm applying that filter, endpoint filter, then only it will be applicable to this endpoint. If I'm not applying, then it will not applicable. Right? So there is no authorized attribute, no allow anonymous attribute. You have to create endpoint filter. If you apply the endpoint filter, then validation is going to be checked. If you do not apply, then validation will not be checked. Clear?
Yep.
Yes.
So let us proceed and see how we can implement this in our application. So first of all, what we need to do, we need to install the package, JWT package. So how to install? So go to the tools, NuGet package manager for solution, go to the browse tab, search for the JWT bearer package. So this is the package based on the compatible version, right? For example, we developed the project using .NET 8. As I already mentioned, I never ever going to use the STS version. Always. And I also recommended you guys to use the LTS version. So in currently .NET 8 is the LTS, right? So for .NET 8, which is compatible 8.0.6, the latest one, right? Of 8. So if you are using targeting .NET Framework 8, and if you are going to use JWT Authentication 9, then it will not work because of a incompatibility issue. So that's what you need to ensure. So now click on the install button, which is going to install the package. So taking some time. Click apply, click I accept, which should install the package, right? So once the package is installed, right, then what we need to do? We need to do few things, right? What are the things? First of all, we need to right, configure the JWT settings. Right. First of all, we need to configure the JWT settings in the app settings.json file. So go to the app settings.json file. So two things I'm going to provide here. One is the secret key, and another one is the issuer. Issuer means, all right, what I can say, who is issuing this, what I can say, uh, who is generating the token, that base URL. Anything you can pass. This is a string value. So I'm passing this one. So this is going to be generated by the right issuer endpoint base URL, who is generating the token. Secret key. This is the secret key, 32-bit secret key. Right. You can get this secret key right from the internet, right? Uh, JWT secret key generate method, right? So here you can generate any, right? For real time, you can use, right, complicated one. Otherwise, you can also use this one, right? So this is going to be generated. So I have replaced that secret key here. Clear, guys? So this is the secret key which is going to be used to generate the token, and this is the URL, base URL of the server who is going to generate the. So these are the two information that what I have stored in my app settings.json file. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class which is going to generate the JWT token. So I can directly write this token within the endpoint which is going to generate the token. But for the safer side, right, for a good programming approach, we should uh, we should not store everything. We should not write any complicated logic within the endpoint. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a class. That class name is going to be token service. You can give any name. And this token service is going to provide one method. And that method is going to generate a JWT token. So let us try to understand. So this is the configuration. Yes, we need this configuration to read the JWT configuration from the app settings.json file, specifically the secret key and the issuer. So I have declared two variable to hold the issuer who issued the token. Secret key, this key is going to be used to sign in the token, right? So and then I'm right within the constructor, I'm taking the dependency object of this I configuration and initializing this I configuration variable, and then based on this configuration variable, I'm reading the issuer and the secret key. If this read issuer is available, that is fine. Otherwise, throw some argument exception. If the secret key is available, that value we will read. Otherwise, we are going to throw some error, right? So now, instead of throwing this one, right, if you want to provide some default value, that is also fine. Right? So instead of throwing, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to provide some default value. So default value means this URL I'm providing here, and this secret key I'm also providing here. So that is up to you if you want to throw or if you want to provide some default value. Right. Next. So this is my method which is going to generate the. Now this is my username method, and right here I'm creating this variable, right? It is going to be a list of claim. While calling this method, if you want to provide some additional claims which you want to store in the token, right, then you can pass those. Again, this is going to be nullable type, so it is not mandatory. If you want, you can also ignore. So now, before proceeding further, first of all, I need to create the list of claims, that subject and the name. So in the subject, I'm storing the username. Here also, I'm storing the username, right? So in real time, whatever information, user ID, roles, claim, right? Whatever information you want to store, you write email ID, user ID. So you know already how to store this thing. So I'm not going to discuss this thing again in detail. So this is the claim. Claims are nothing but the user information. How you are going to identify the user. So that user specific information you need to store in the claim. So, and one more thing guys, you have to remember, the more number of claims you store in the token, that the token size is going to be increased. So only store whichever is required and necessary. Unnecessary things storing in the token means your token size is going to be increased, right? So again, if any additional claims are there, then those claims also I'm going to add inside this claims collection. So I'm creating the key, I'm creating the credential, I'm using the HMAC to write it to 56 SAR to 56 algorithm. And then this algorithm based on the provided key, it is going to create my credential. And this credential is basically going to use to generate the token. So for generating the token, whatever the issuer, right, whatever the claims, when the token is going to be expired, and this information I have supplied. And finally I'm going to use this token, I'm passing this token to this write token method, which is going to generate the token, and that token is going to be written in a string format. So basically, if I call this method by passing the username and the list of additional optional claims, it is going to create a token with the user, right, with the subject and the name claim along with these additional claims. and also the token duration is going to be 1 hour. And for generating the token, it is making use of this secret key and this issuer. And once the token is generated, that token I'm returning from this method. Clear?
Yeah.
Right. So here,
So while
right.
generating token, we require only four things, right? Issuer, and then
No,
do we?
another thing is their audience. But again, if your application is going to be consumed by multiple audience, you cannot do that. And right, we have already discussed, right, how to use audience, how to use issue, right? So did you attend our JWT sessions? You are morning batch student or evening batch student?
No, in morning.
Morning means you should not ask this question. Why? Because we have already discussed this JWT concept in detail. Did you attend those sessions?
I missed those sessions.
So you should not miss those sessions because these are the advanced scenario, right? Just go and watch. So what is JWT? What are the three different sections of a JWT? What is request? What is signature? What is payload? And all these things we have discussed, right? But again, in the coming days, I'm going to discuss this thing in the evening batch also, right? If you want, you can attend, right? But already we have discussed this thing in the morning. For time being, remember these are the minimum information which is required for generating the token, right?
Okay, sir.
So once the token service is generated, next what we need to do, we need to create one authorization filter. Guys, remember in MBC application, I mean in the controller based approach, we are making use of a authorized attribute, which internally going to check what is the default authentication scheme registered, and based on that registered scheme, it is going to validate the incoming request, right? Validating the incoming request. But with minimal API, we don't have that luxuries. So we cannot make use of authorized attribute or allow anonymous attribute to our endpoints. So for this purpose, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make use of this JWT authorization endpoint filter class. So I'm going to create a filter class. And filter class is going to validate whether the user is authenticated. If authenticated, that is fine. If not authenticated, it is going to return 401 error. You can also apply some kind of a, right, what I can say, uh, role-based authentication you can also apply. So I'm not going with that role-based authentication because if your authentication is very complicated, then you should not use minimal API. Minimal API is basically used for what? Basically used for some kind of a simple API or small API, right? But again, if you want, you can also apply. So here you can see the signature you already aware about the context object, the next delegate returning object null. So this is the context.http context, so I can access the HTTP context. So from the HTTP context, we need to check whether the user is already authenticated or not. HTTP context.user.identity is authenticated. If it is not null and if it is not true, then what we need to do, we need to return unauthorized. Means 401 error, it will return to the client. Along with this unauthorized, if you want to apply, right, if you want to apply the role-based authentication. So basically, if you want to check whether the user having in this role or not, then in that case, right, you can apply. Again, that role, whatever you are going to apply, you can also take as a input parameter here, right? So I mean, you need to create this right, you need to provide the constructor. In the constructor you need to you have to create one variable to hold the role. In the constructor you need to initialize that variable, and that variable you need to check here, right? So whether, right, whatever the role, you need to ensure the user should have before accessing the endpoint. Now we are not using this one, but I have provided. If you want, you can also go with the role based authentication. So now, if the user is authenticated, if the user is authorized, then only we need to invoke the next middleware component. That might be the right endpoint handler. That might be a another endpoint filter, right? Whatever it may be, right? So that is what it is going to check. Clear what this endpoint filter is going to do?
Yep.
Now once this is done, now what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a DTO for generating the token, right? For generating the token, I need the username and password, which I will receive as which I will receive from the client. So for that purpose, to hold those information, I'm going to make use of this login DTO. So this DTO is going to have two parameters. One is username and another one is password. So whatever the username password the user needs to provide, for that purpose we are going to create one endpoint. That endpoint will make use of this login DTO, and the user needs to provide username password to get the token. So for that purpose we are going to use again this username password, both are mandatory field. So once this is done, next what we need to do, we need to configure the JWT validation. I mean how the token is going to be validated, what is the default authentication scheme, right? All these things we need to register, right? So let us proceed and then do this thing practically. So first of all, go to this program.cs class file. So this is going to be my, after this one, so I need to configure my authentication service. So basically, I'm specifying that my default authentication scheme is going to be bearer authentication, and please use the default right authentication challenge, right? So I mean, if the authentication is failed, what is the different response format that what you need written for the 401, 403? Please return the response in the default format only. So that what if I mean if you are not customizing, then that default option will come into the picture. So first one will ensure the default authentication is going to be JWT, and second one will ensure for the JWT right authentication, right? Whenever the authentication is failed, then what is the default format or default response for 401, 403? Please return that. Then here also we are specifying how the JWT token is going to be validated. So that validation, do you want to validate the issuer true? Do you want to validate the audience? No. So we are not currently using any audience. Validate the token lifetime. Yes. If the token is expired, then don't consider that valid token. Validate the issuer sign-in key. Yes. So whatever the key we are using for validating, please use the same key. And what is the validated issuer, right? That value we are retrieving from the right offsetting start JSON file. And issuer sign-in key, right? We are making sure issuer sign-in key means the same sign-in key I'm going to use, right? For example, in this case, whatever the sign-in key or the secret key we are using, that secret key also we need to use here, right? So this is, and this services you need to register to enable authorization, right? So this is authentication and this is authorization. So these two middleware component you have to register first. So once this two middleware component is registered, next what we need to do, guys? Then we need to register the token service and the JWT endpoint filter. So basically, you can see I have created one endpoint filter and I have created one token service. So this token service and endpoint filter I need to register. So let me go ahead. So before the build method, see guys, remember whenever you are registering these services, the sequence doesn't matter. So for example, if I register these services here, it is not going to make any impact, right? But again, but yes, the middleware component sequence is going to be intact. So registering these services, any sequence you can put no matter, but registering this middleware component, right, sequence is a matter. That's what you need to remember. So here, what I need to do next? Next, I need to register my token service and register my JWT authentication endpoint filter. So once this is done, next what I need to do? Next, I need to create one public endpoint which is going to return the token. So basically, here you can see before this one. So I'm creating one login endpoint. It is a post request. It is going to take the login video as an input and a token service. So this token service, it will use to generate the token, and this is going to my login DTO. If you are going to make use of asynchronous programming, then you can also make the method as async like this. But for now, this token generation, it is going to be done, right? Not exactly what I can say. It is a static, I mean non-asynchronous, so synchronous method. So I'm not using, but you can also use. And here for the demo purpose, what I'm doing here, see, in real time, you should have the user table or wherever you want to validate the username and password, that table must be exist. And that validation you need to check. The time being, alright, what I'm doing here for the demonstration purpose, whatever the username and password the user is provided, that must be displayed. So this is just for the demonstration purpose. Username must be admin, password must be password. Otherwise, we are going to return unauthorized. Once the token is generated, right? Once the user is validated, then we are calling this generate token service method, by passing the username, whatever we received as input parameter, and the list of additional claims. So basically, I'm going to add the role claim, right? And once the token is generated, then we are going to return OK, 200 OK response, and that corresponding token. Clear?
Yeah.
Right. Now what I need to do, I need to apply that what I can say authentication filter. So where I need to apply. See, suppose this is my endpoint. I want this endpoint to be accessible by everyone. So if you want this endpoint to be accessible by everyone, then you do not need to apply this endpoint filter. This is JWT authorization endpoint filter. Now, so this endpoint I want to apply filter. So if I want to apply filter here, then where I need to apply the filter? So I mean that logging filter should be the first one, should be the second one, or should be the third one. Where? What is the best place?
What is the
First
first one,
login.
please?
It will be on top.
It will on top. If you apply it will on top, then is it going to check, right, whether the request is received by your server or not?
It don't check.
No.
So basically, it should become as part of the second. So first of all, the request must be received so that we can track whether the request received or not. And once the request received, then only we are going to check whether the authorization logic is available or not. Similarly, you can also apply here, right? If you want, you can also apply here, right? And you can also apply here, right? So that is what you need to understand. Clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
So with these changes, now let me run the application and see whether it is working fine or not. Okay. See employee. So this employee's endpoint, does it apply with the right JWT authentication filter? No. That means what? That means it should be access. So let me show you this thing. I'm getting the response. Yes, I'm getting the response. Now, if I want to apply right access this endpoint, get by ID. So is this decorated with the JWT authorization endpoint filter? Yes. And for yes means what? You should provide a valid JWT token. So now call. So what I'm getting? I'm getting this error response 401. Why? Because we have not provided a valid JWT token. So now if you want to get the token, then what should be the username and password? Admin. And here you need to provide password. So with these changes, let me run the application. See, we are getting the token. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my Postman, right? So 7231 is the URL employees by ID, right? So this is going to be, this is my URL, right? Now I'm going to pass this one. So let me call without authentication. See, I'm getting unauthorized. Now I'm going to call this with authorization token. So the token is generated here. Copy this token and paste it here. Bearer and this one. Now inform this one. So I'm getting the response. Now, if you want to, if you don't want to use this authorization and all this thing, you can go to here and you can also set the bearer token. See? So you can also set and you can also inform like this. Clear?
Yes.
Right. So this is how you can apply authentication. So with this, our minimal API is completed. So next Monday we are going to discuss unit testing. So 2 sessions I will take for unit testing, and after 2 sessions, the final session will be our deployment kind of deployment. So mostly 3 sections are there. Can minimal API has more than one model? Yes, definitely it should have one model. But guys, remember, if you are going to deal with multiple entities, multiple model, and your application is going to be complicated, complex one, then you should not use minimal API. For that purpose, you should go with controller-based approach. Clear, guys?
Yep. Thank you.
So, guys, 3 more sessions remaining to complete the course syllabus. 2 sessions for unit testing and one more session for deployment, right? Deploying the application into IIS, generating the SSL certificate. All these things we will discuss in one, and that will be our last session. So 3 more sessions, mostly in the coming, right, in the next week, we are going to complete. Anyone having any more question?
Morning session?
Ready?
Is it in the morning? The next
Yeah,
unit test?
only 2 sessions are there in the morning.
Okay.
For the evening batch student, they are going to have only 2 sessions in the morning. After then, we will come back to our evening slot. Clear?
Yep.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir.